Welcome to the Brain Trust Driving Change podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Bloomfield. And whether you're a leader, a coach, a salesperson, or even a parent, this podcast focuses on how to leverage the science of decision making to help you become a more impactful communicator and a driving force for change. Welcome back to the Driving Change podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Bloomfield. And the Driving Change podcast is all about finding unique human beings out there in the world who are making a difference and letting us, through their story, understand how we ourselves might make a bigger difference. And today is certainly going to be one of those episodes. It's an honor to have Dr. Megan Gerhardt with us. And she is not just a speaker and a consultant and an author, and we're going to get into her work in a minute, but also a professor of management and leadership at the Farmer School of Business at Miami University. She's also the director of leadership development for the Farmer School and the Robert D. Johnson co-director of the Isaac and Oxley Center for Business Leadership. Now, what I like about her work is she's been published all over the place, by the way. She's published on works from individual differences to motivation to leadership and generational differences in the workplace. She's been featured in the Harvard Business Review, which she got some stuff to tell us about that in a minute. NBC News, the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, the Chronicle, MarketWatch. I can go on Inc. magazine. She's brilliant. She's had a TEDx talk on why I love millennials, and you should too. Some of you right now need to hear that message. Go out and look in the TEDx, and you can find her by her name, Megan Gerhardt. And she's also created this movement, this Gentelligence movement, and her book's phenomenal. And if you go to her website, www.profgerhardt.com, PROFGERHARDT, and we'll have this in the comments and we'll talk about it at the end as well. She can really help you think about leveraging individual differences to achieve leadership impact and extraordinary levels of performance. And what I love about her, why I wanted to have her on, was we are working today in the marketplace with more change and more uncertainty than probably in human history. And with 4 generations still active in the marketplace and in the workplace and the places you're working, with remote stuff happening and lots of craziness, there's never been a more important time to talk about how to communicate with each other at a different level. So, Megan, thank you very much for being on.
Well, thank you for having me, Jeff. I'm excited.
So, our guests always start with the same story. I always ask the first question. Let the listeners and the viewers in a little bit on your origin story. Where do you come from? Who are you? What do you believe in? Give us some of that. What's your why?
I do have my why, so I can start with that. My why is to create interesting conversations that will change the way people think. So that is at the heart and in the core of everything that I do. I think probably I'm best able to describe myself as a teacher. So I come from a long line of teachers. My grandma and grandpa were both teachers. My mom's a teacher, was a teacher. And that's what thought leadership is to me, is teaching. I think that's the vehicle that I am most passionate about. And you can see that in a lot of my work. And, I think I've been most inspired by teachers when I see, I think in the kind of work that I do, I'm a talent spotter. I can sort of spot the people who have just this very strong, unique kind of talent for whatever it is they're passionate about. And I love being able to help foster that in a lot of different ways, whether it's in a classroom or workshop or coaching or whatever it is. But I think personally, I've been most impacted by the people who had that unique talent for teaching. And certainly my own teachers growing up, different levels, people who understood how to bring forth things in people they didn't know they had, or people that were able to spark your thinking in a different way is really what I'm passionate about. And then when I was in graduate school, or part of our preparation, of course, is to learn to teach. I had the opportunity and the privilege really to be a teaching assistant for a woman who is probably one of the greatest teachers I've ever witnessed in my life. And she was teaching large groups of students at the university who didn't want to necessarily be there. It was, introduction classes, things they were required to take. And she was just mesmerizing. And it was a different kind of teaching that I had seen before. And it didn't matter that there were hundreds of people in the room. She just was able to draw them in with stories. It was with personality. It was with her knowledge, all of those things. And I just remember sitting in that auditorium and thinking, I'm going to learn to do that. And I think throughout my career, so this is my 19th year as a faculty member, as a professor, I've had several colleagues that I've sat and observed and thought, oh, the way they can spark discussion or connect ideas when they hear people put them out or help people understand how things go together. That's what energizes me. And I think about, when I was developing my own why statement, I thought that's what it is for me, right? If I finish a class or a talk and someone comes up and says, I'd never thought about that before. Like, that's it for me. That's the moment that I live for. I don't actually need people to agree with me. I'm okay. And sometimes it's even more, I think, interesting and important when people push back or they disagree. But if it moves their thinking in any direction, right? Because we had that interesting conversation, then I'm there for that. That's what I'm all about, for sure.
So did you know, I loved your example of when you sat in the auditorium and knew when you watched that professor, that teacher do that, that's where the real spark came. Did you know when you were a little girl that you wanted to be a teacher? Because back on some of those influences, or where was that? Was the moment where you did you meander for a while before you discovered that was going to be your gift?
When I think back to it, right, when I do all these great life mapping exercises I have other people do, I always make myself do them as well. I have really strong memories of playing school when I was younger. Playing college was something that I don't think maybe most normal children do that, but getting in my stack of books and carrying it to classes. And I just love school. I loved everything about school and from every direction. When I was in college, actually in college, not playing college, I changed my major 3 times. I was an education major for about 5 minutes. And because I knew there was something about the teaching that I was interested in, but I didn't think that was quite it. And I landed on being a psychology major because human behavior is what, my passion is. That's what I'm fascinated by. And so I took every psychology class they would let me take. I think I went to the University of Iowa. They capped us out at 50 hours of a particular subject and they made you stop. And so I was done by my first semester, my senior year. They wouldn't let me take anymore. But I loved it. I was doing research in it. And I thought, okay, if I could teach people about human behavior, then that's it. That's the spot. And so I began thinking about graduate school. I realized that was a job, right? That I didn't ever actually had to leave school. I just was going to flip to the other side of the desk. And so I think that was where this interest in education and teaching merged with my fascination with human behavior. And then, to be completely honest, I've always loved a stage. I played with acting when I was in college. I wasn't particularly good at it, but I just loved the stage. And I realize now, it wasn't the acting on the stage that I liked, it was the stage, right? So when you can teach on any kind of stage or with any kind of, audience and start planting some seeds and helping people think about things in a different way. I think that's how it all came together for me. And I realized, the sort of crucible story I talk about with my teaching is when I was in graduate school, when you go train to be an academic, they very much focus on your research and the importance of research, which is incredibly important. You want to make sure that you're contributing to knowledge in a field. But I remember I had my own class at that point. I was teaching, my own sections, and I loved it. I loved it so much. And I remember I got a performance review letter from my faculty. It said something like, the faculty have noticed that you are passionate about and talented in teaching, but we'd like to advise you that right now that's not the best way for you to be spending your time. And I still have that letter somewhere because it was the first time as an adult that I remember reading something that people in authority that I respected very much had sort of told me and thinking they're wrong. I just had this visceral values-based reaction to, I understand why they're telling me that because I'll get a better, quote unquote, higher paying, more prestigious job. I have more research, and the more time you spend on teaching, it's not a good return on investment in that way. They're training us to, go to these very prestigious research schools. And I just thought, oh, they're wrong. Right. I don't agree. It was such a moment of clarity for me. I talk about it a lot in my workshops that I thought, that's not who I am. I want to go somewhere where teaching is just as valuable as other parts of our work. So that's what I did. So
yeah, I've always been fascinated by that, and I like people that have the term applied in front of their specialty, applied neuroscientist, applied psychologist, applied, right? Because that means that you can actually teach what you're doing to other people so they can, wait for it, apply it.
Right.
Versus just doing a bunch of research, which is simply just information.
Right.
And information is great, but information not applied is useless, right? And so I love that you had that epiphany early on. So as you go through and you process through, you get your degree, you're moving into it, you're going to become faculty, you're a professor now, you have this this epiphany, and you recognize that your purpose is to have the light bulb go off in other people's heads. It goes off in your head, and then you can take that light bulb and you can plug it into somebody else and get it to go off in their head.
Yes, well said.
And I love that because I think that life, or no matter what when you're listening out there, whatever people say, what's my purpose? I'm trying to pursue my purpose. Well, your purpose always has to make something better for somebody else. If you're not pursuing something that has some impact on other human beings, you're probably not fulfilling your purpose. So that's just an aside. And I think you found that lane and that niche quite well. So let's get into a little bit of where you're really, really strong right now and what you've really been talking a lot about, and lots of organizations and conferences and groups are bringing you out to talk about. And you wrote your book on this topic of Gentelligence, a revolutionary approach to leading an intergenerational workforce. There was an insight that you come up with here that I found fascinating, that only 6% of organizations agree that their leaders are equipped to lead a multi-generational workforce effectively. So before you unpack that insight, my first question is, what made you realize that this multi-generational concept wasn't just a fly-by-night, fad, that it really was having a direct negative impact on the marketplace and on people's lives, and you became passionate about? Where was that? When did that light bulb go off?
So for me, when I did start my career as a professor, I was really young. I had just turned 26, maybe a month after my 26th birthday or two, came out here and started as a professor. And what that meant, it meant obviously that I had a lot of things to learn. And I, learned quite a bit from my colleagues who are older, as most of us do, on how to do things. But because of my age, I was so much closer in age to my students than I was to most of my colleagues at the time. And I was certainly one of the only people in my sort of age bracket in my university at the time. And so I found myself leaning across sort of the generation gap in the other way and asking students for input and feedback. And, it's always been interesting to me. I think it's very important and easy to ask people for input. It doesn't mean you're giving away your decision-making power, but I'm fascinated by, what do you think of this, or what's your perspective on it? And I learned so much in both directions that it became very much a strategy I use throughout my career. I'm not even close to age to my students now, but I still do it every single day. And so I thought, well, what a fantastic source of learning. And not just learning, but by, it really does open up these channels of communication when you're asking people. It's human nature. When people are asked for their perspective or their advice or their insight, they are much more willing and interested to hear what you have to say in response, right?
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. Isn't that just, and I thought, I believe, they can give me all these great fresh ideas. And then when I say, oh, I love that, I have some questions about practically maybe how we would get this done, or there's some institutional things that I'm concerned about. It's not me shutting them down or talking down to me. It's us having a conversation. And so I thought, what a great, sort of way to be able, of course, working in a university, I have, an endless supply of wonderful young people that I get to work with every day. But I just thought, what a great way to learn. And I was sure that this had to be a kind of learning and a way of leveraging diversity of thought that organizations would be also trying to figure out, right? How do we do this best? But time-wise, that really coincided with the entry of the millennials into the workplace. And that was such a shock to sort of the workplace, the millennials not only just being significantly larger in size than my generation, Gen X, had been, but fundamentally different in norms, in attitudes, in the way they had been raised to have voice and go after what they wanted, and that they could be anything they wanted to be. And that was being looked at incredibly negative, right? There was a very negative lens being put on their difference. And so those two things kind of came together. My passion for that being, intergenerational learning and collaboration being such a key strategy, and the frustration and negativity around millennials and their perceived entitlement. So those two things kind of, were occurring together. And so I started getting asked to come speak to groups come tell us what to do about these millennials, like a capital T and a capital M.
Right.
And I thought, oh, they don't get it, right? I was just struck by this. They don't understand what I understand about this. They're looking at it wrong. How do I help them frame it? What kind of conversation could I create where we could stop having this sort of contentious us versus them mindset and shift it to how fantastic that we have all these different perspectives and experiences to pull from. And so that's where Gentelligence began, was my thought that we know actually in human behavior and organizational behavior, we know how to effectively leverage and lead differences. That's what successful DE&I is all about. That's what successful cross-cultural management was. But I was never hearing anything about looking at generations as a form of culture.
Okay.
It was looked at as sort of this annoying difference that how do we teach these kids they're doing it wrong, right? How do we get them to do it the right way? And I thought it was just fascinating to me that everything we knew about how to manage and leverage difference was not being applied to this particular kind of difference. And so I thought, that's my goal. Apply what we know works to this incredibly important kind of diversity and shift the conversation from one of negativity and threat to one to opportunity and kind of asset. And that's really what drove me to do both academic research, speaking, and then ultimately in the last couple of years to write the book.
Yeah, that's great. I feel like, we always teach not only our clients, but anyone who will listen to us, that to really go back to the root cause of human behavior, it starts with what we call self-preservation orientation, that our brains are built for self-preservation. And the brain is naturally wired to look at differences and initially through the lens of risk mitigation.
Right.
So if I see something that's different, my brain is designed to assume that it's a risk until I can prove that it's not. And so in human behavior, we do the same thing. We put someone who's not looking like us, who doesn't come from our same walk of life, as the out group that's risky or dangerous until I can somehow figure out a way to put them in the in group, meaning that they're safe.
Exactly.
And I think I wanted to ask you the question and have you react to that. Some of it's neuroscience, right? But a lot of it's the behavioral psychology around the threat, the risk that we perceive someone different than us. And this doesn't matter, D&I, diversity, equity, inclusion, same thing. But in this case, we're talking about multi-generational differences. And did you find in your work, when you started to look at this generational conflict that had arisen, it really did kind of go back to, depending on the generations, how they perceive the other generation as different and therefore as a threat versus trying to get them moved to the point where they could see the benefit?
Yes, absolutely. I was just writing something about this yesterday because the research shows that left to their own devices, an age-diverse workforce is going to experience conflict and tension. It's going to be a hot mess. It's going to be a source of, frustration. And obviously that's what most of us have experienced. And it's just like almost any other type of diversity. If you don't know what to do with it, naturally, we will react just as you said. I perceive that person as being different than me. This is concerning. And I'm going to distance myself from them. And whatever they do or say, I need to look at sort of with this air of caution. And it comes from a couple of really interesting places, around scarcity, right? Which particularly right now, we're seeing that which is maybe something we'll talk about later in the conversation. But is there enough for everybody? And are these people taking something that I need, right? Are we in a competition and I didn't get the memo and I'm going to be sort of suspicious of you? But we also found things like in the workplace, age is only second to race in terms of a demographic factor that impacts your social networks. So you're going to gravitate to hang out with people at work who are similar in age to you. And because of that, you don't have meaningful connections with people often who are not of your age group. You have stereotypes, you have cliches, you have sort of, these broad brush of what those people are like. You don't have a chance to replace those with meaningful interactions that allow you to move somebody from an out group into an in group, unless there's some sort of effort or process put in place to help that happen. So research would show without any kind of intervention, it is conflict and tension. With intervention, we can get to that other side where we're learning from difference, we're leveraging different perspectives, we're increasing performance and satisfaction. And, but we didn't have that intervention, right? And that's what Gentelligence aims to fill, is that gap.
Wow, let me back up a second, because I think there's something there's some tension here I want everyone to experience. So you said in the workforce today, the number one, driving in-group, out-group factor is race. Number two is age.
Yes.
I'm sure gender is in there somewhere. But I want everyone to process that in a second. In the place you work today, your subconscious behavior is you're drawn to people who are of your same race and your same age. And the reason that you're drawn to them is because your subconscious brain perceives them more like you, therefore safer. And to think of what you're missing out on by people who are different race, by people who are a different age and a different gender, and all these different labels, right, that our subconscious brain, unfortunately, look, it's a wonderful thing, right? It keeps us safe, protects us, all of those things, but it's so limiting in our ability to expand our knowledge of ideas and innovation and creativity. And it's not necessary. That's the thing I'm struck by this, is that when we look at differences like race, in this case, like age, our brains are telling us that the differences will hurt us when it's a lie. We don't know that to be true. In fact, it's likely not true, but our subconscious is hardwired to say, hey, the safety box you built for your whole life is probably better than trying to step out and take a risk by listening to somebody who looks, feels, sounds different than you. And so that's what you're talking about, right? That's the world we're living in today, is that our subconscious biases and behaviors are really headwinds against our willingness to mindfully do things that would allow us to be inclusive and gain from all of that incredible diversity of ideas.
Exactly. And it is a double-edged sword, because there is plenty of research and evidence showing that when it works, when we can exchange information or perspectives, or, that we're with people to create sort of a knowledge-based kind of knowing and in a strong connection that way, there's a significant return on that investment. We're just very unlikely to get to the point where that's going to be allowed to happen. And so if we stay on that other side of, I don't know, you're not like me, so I'm not sure, we're never getting to the place where we can actually experience the benefit. And as you were talking, it reminded me of something from my teaching that I learned somewhere along the way, which was I always start my courses, with the notion and the discussion with students that we're in this together, right? It's not an us versus them. I'm not here to be punitive. I'm not here to be judgmental. I'm here for the same reason you're here. And I'm going to only make decisions that are going to be mutually beneficial to all of us together. And they can tell, right? They know whether you're in it with them or not with them.
Right.
And, saying, well, yes, I'm a teacher and you're a student, but we have a lot I'm here to learn from you as much as you're here to learn from me, completely changes the dynamic just in that classroom. And so, that's what we're trying to take into the workplace is if you could step away from seeing people in other generations as competitors and see them as collaborators, what would then be possible, right? And why aren't we doing things as leaders or as organizations to facilitate that? That statistic that you shared a little bit ago, 6%, that was from Deloitte's Insight report this year. So that's really current data, saying they strongly agree we're ready. And I actually asked that question at the beginning. I do a poll when I do virtual workshops and webinars. And it's, people will give their own organization a little more credit on a Zoom webinar, even if it's anonymous, but it's not very high. They're a little more confident that they could navigate it than they are that their organization knows what they're doing.
Well, the issue I think might be with that insight is define equipped. If I'm saying if only 6% believe they're equipped, it's probably worse than that in a lot of ways, because if you really define what equipped means based on what you preach in Gentelligence, I don't know if it's even that high, right?
Right. It's I think at best, I was digging into for something else. I was digging into age diversity training or generational diversity training. And I think the best we get are those sort of cookie cutter, here are the generations in the workplace. Here are the events that define them. And here is what we know about them, which is better than nothing. And to be honest, my early workshops, that's what they were, and it was interesting enough. It was sort of a sociological, like how do generations form? And it's, I think most people have had some sort of introduction to that. But that's the beginning of the story. That's not the end. And it also is really tricky. Gentelligence is about being smarter about how we do this, right? At its core. And to be smarter, you have to go beyond, the boxes of every generation. And you can say, well, I always say generations are a layer of your identity. So the academic work on this is sort of frustrating. And we talked about the importance of doing applied work. And when I really dug into what was being done academically, it was mostly a debate about whether generational differences existed because academics were having trouble finding them. And so, of course, if we can't find something, our response is like, well, then it's not actually real. And I know that millions of people actually out there doing the work believe it is, but you're wrong because we did a survey and we can't find it. And so what I realized, because I didn't want to get caught in that spin of do generational differences really exist? Well, what does that mean, really exist? And I think, Jeff, it comes down to something that I think is critically important for this conversation, is that we all have universal needs. There's plenty of evidence showing, everyone, regardless of age, any kind of demographic difference, we all have a need for autonomy, for connection, for either respect or competency, depending on what you're looking at. And so when academics look across generations, everybody says those things matter. And then they stop and go, see, everybody's the same. I don't know what you're all getting all worked up about. But we miss the part of the conversation where, yes, I have a strong need for respect in the workplace, as does, a 26-year-old. The norms that we've learned on how to fulfill those needs look very different. And so while we both underlying, our actions, our behaviors, our workplace interactions is the same. I'm striving to be respected. The pursuit of those may look very different. And so that's where we tend to get a lot of miscommunication and frustration. So I have a story about this. My dad is 73. He's a baby boomer, retired attorney. And when the book came out this summer, he said, well, I got a question for you about this. He said, when I started my career, to get respect, you went in, you put your head down, you did your work. And when it was time, somebody came in and tapped you on the shoulder and said, John, it's time for your promotion. By the time I retired, these young people, I always like to point out that's
capital T, right?
Capital T. They were coming in to tell me it was time for their promotion. I didn't get it, right? That's labeled entitled. So I thought, let's break that down. What a great example. And I said, well, they wanted the same thing you wanted, right? They wanted to be respected. They wanted to be recognized as competent. But the norms when you grew up was that you put your head down and you don't tell the person in charge what's going on or what to do. You wait. And you might have very much wanted to go in and ask when it was your time, but that wasn't socially acceptable. That wasn't a tool that was available to you or anyone else you knew. But by the time these would have been millennials entered the workplace, they were the product of younger baby boomers who almost did this social experiment of what would be possible if we invested in these children from a very young age. We sent them to mommy and me and itty bitty soccer and, Spanish for 4-year-olds and developed their self-esteem and protected them and gave them every opportunity, which comes from a really, really good place, and kept a really close eye on them. And that was a 180-degree shift from Gen X that were roaming neighborhoods and latchkey kids and, the last sort of independent generation. It just changed. Times changed, parenting norms changed. We wanted to see what was possible. And what was possible was the most developed and educated generation we'd ever seen that grew up believing they had a voice that people wanted to hear and that their priorities and needs were the center of things. That's what family rotated around. That's what schedules rotated around. And so when they got to the workplace, that was the norm. Of course they would come in and ask you, like, I'm ready, Jeff.
Right.
Like, is it time for me? Because that's what they've been doing their whole life, is going after it and being told they were worth it. And it came from this need for respect. It just looked entirely different. And baby boomers who had raised those kids were the ones calling me and saying, I don't know what to do with this, right? It was this great realization that every generation develops the tools that help them be successful. And we gave them these tools, and then we didn't want them using them on us.
Right. Yeah, that's great. Well, you might already have this. If not, the visual, I'm a visual guy, right? So I'm processing all this is, Dr. Megan Gerhardt's hierarchy of multi-generational needs. The old Maslow's, you got your own pyramid here, but you can define and look and see how similar they are as you go up, but then your difference will be how they show up and how they get met. That's the gold.
Yeah.
Now, here's the question and where the conflict arises, right? So I'm an Xer. I was the latchkey kid running around on my bike everywhere. And I have a different philosophy on life than my parents did. And clearly my kids do. When I have that moment, what if I don't agree with it? Right? So what if I'm out there and I'm a boomer, I'm a Gen Xer in the workplace, and I've got these millennials or even Gen Zs that have that, and I'm going to play the part of devil's advocate on they're coddled, right? That's one of the things you hear.
Sure, snowflakes.
They're snowflakes.
Right.
They're coddled. What do you mean you're going to tell me when you're going to get promoted? What do you mean you believe in yourself? Like that you can do, wait a minute. And around here, this is how we do it. So how do I hear them and yet not label them? Like, how does that work? How do you help?
That's the apply part, right?
Yeah.
We have a lot of strategies and tools in the book, but I'll tell you the easiest ones are, I start every chapter in the book with a quote because I'm a quote person, but it's the Whitman quote, be curious, not judgmental. And so for me, it's a conversation where you sit down when they come in and you immediately, right, you think, okay, who do they think they are? Whatever the reaction is. And there's a tool that we use in the book that's from actually cross-cultural management, right? So you go to Italy and you sit down and you order your food and you're done and they don't bring you your check, right? Everybody who's traveled abroad has had some version of this experience. And you think, I don't like this. I'm being ignored. This is rude. I'm being disrespected. You're immediately evaluating it. You're coddled. You're entitled. And this tool, it's called the Describe, Interpret, Evaluate exercise. We didn't create it. We borrowed it, the die. Then says you describe what's going on. How did I interpret it? And then you pause and say, is there another way to evaluate what's going on? And sometimes you don't know, right? When I come in and I see a behavior, whether it's a student coming in wanting to argue about an exam that I've given them. Like the first time that happens to any faculty member, you're like, excuse you? Like, you don't have a degree. Why are we having this conversation? Like, that's your grade. But then if you think, all right, is there another way to understand this behavior that I'm not seeing? Because you're seeing it through your own lens,
sure.
Right?
Self-preservation, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so if you can pause and think, okay, this probably isn't a personal attack. This probably isn't, they didn't come in here with the intent to offend me so what might another explanation be? So I'm very practical. I suggest things like asking, help me understand. I heard you thinking it's time for you to get your promotion. Help me understand what your, drive is here, what your concerns are. One of the things I think that we don't think about with millennials and as well as with Gen Z is they want to know why. It's not that they necessarily need it to be their way or they think they know best. Like I found them to be overall very interested in mentorship and in development. They want to understand why they're being asked to do things a certain way. And the answer of, well, we've always done them that way isn't going to work.
Right.
And so if you can say, well, help me understand what brings you in here today. I'm hearing, you're ready, you feel like you're ready, and I'd love to discuss that more with you. Why from your perspective do you feel you're ready? Would love to hear that, right? So you're inviting in this conversation of, I respect you and I understand, that you're coming in here because this is important to you. And I'm going to have that conversation. I'm not going to start with, no way, you've only been here 6 months. I'm going to start with, help me understand. And that understanding and them getting a chance to speak and be heard, and then us getting to then in sort of exchange teach, right? So I've never learned, I've heard you. Here's some things I want to add into the conversation. And what you're doing then is you don't have to change how long someone has to be there to have a promotion or switch norms so that we use the norms that the younger people want, but explaining why we have the norms we have, which is actually really important for all of us because sometimes there's no good reason, right? Sometimes it's like, well, I don't know. I had to wait 3 years, so you have to too. That's probably not going to fly, and you might not like that. But let's have a conversation about it. Maybe it's time to re-examine that. Maybe not for this particular person, but as an organization, right? Especially if a lot of people are coming in from that generation and wanting to do that. So help me understand is my favorite because it makes me pause. I always learn something. And then if it's just not, that promotion's not happening, this year, most of the time, having a conversation about why or what else needs to happen before it accomplishes that need for respect. I've been heard, they respect me, I'm not being blown off, but it's not time for that, but no explanation and no context just isn't good enough anymore, right? Seek the understanding, I think is rather than judging it because it's different than what you would have done.
Was that the old Stephen Covey quote, right? Seek first to understand before you respond.
Yeah, Whitman, Covey, pick your sage there.
Well, it's interesting because, in our neuro coaching program, what we've discovered, and Dr. Dan Doherty on our team, and his work for his Ph.D. was, there's 3 types of vision in an organization. There's organizational vision, there's the leader coach vision, and then there's the employee or the team member vision. And if the coach doesn't have a conversation with the employee where they get to hear their vision early and understand where they're coming from, understand their perspective, and help them kind of roadmap their vision, then what happens is you get these people coming in with all these expectations that you as a leader might not have. You said, where's you have no perspective. What are you coming in with that? But if I understand your vision, and we've kind of decided collectively, we've co-created what a path looks like, then you're never caught off guard with those conversations. But here's what I found, and I'm the chiefest of sinners on this probably, as the Apostle Paul once said, you have to take the time to do it. Mm-hmm. And so many leaders, especially boomers and Xers, we're grinders. And we're on the treadmill on 11, and we kind of get our identity out of working hard and as a result, we're performers of a transactional result, which doesn't make us very good coaches and very good leaders because we haven't actually translated that down in helping those people share their vision, right? So then if I don't know your personal vision, how am I ever going to have a conversation with you to give you a perspective that's different than what you're asking for, right? So, okay, let me ask you this. So I love your perspective on that piece of it. So one of the things, let's just summarize a minute. So if you're out there today and you're leading or managing, I hate the word managing because you can't manage people. You can only manage process. This could be your problem if you're listening out there. You got to lead people, coach them. But if you're in a managerial role of some sort out there, when's the last time you've actually met with your people individually and understood their vision and their point of view and their perspective and their why? Because that will go a long way to helping start to bridge some of that. But now my question is, and I want to get really tactical for some of these leaders out there that are probably still like, I can see them all right now. They got their arms crossed, just sitting back going, this is a bunch of coddled. I'm not buying into this yet. What is the cost of generational conflict to an organization?
So I think we're seeing a lot of it right now. And we focused a lot on younger people. But if we think about whatever you want to call it, the great resignation, the great reshuffle, any organization that was just sort of phoning in their human capital, leadership or how they invested in their people, the result of that's happening now, right? Anybody that didn't feel appreciated or valued is looking on LinkedIn for maybe there's something different out there. And we gave the millennials we gave them a very hard time on almost everything, to be fair, but we gave them a really hard time about being fickle, job hoppers, things like that. And Gallup had some data that showed they weren't necessarily changing jobs any faster than Gen X had at that age. But they were very vocal about leaving and that they would leave or why they were leaving. And again, if you dig beneath the behavior, a lot of it was they want to be places where they are going to be They believe they'll be developed, that they believe somebody cares about them. I did research, it's been about 6 years ago now, looking at how do different generations, view things like credibility. And one thing that has surfaced in younger generations is connection. They want to feel connected, that somebody took the time to have the conversation about their vision or their goals. And if that person then says, well, we're not quite there yet, but I can see you getting there in the next 6 months, great. Then they're going to stay because they think, okay, I'm going to go work hard in 6 months. That is the reality rather than the stereotype about that generation is, we all probably would have loved to have somebody sit down and have that conversation about our goals and our vision, but Gen Xers and boomers, that wasn't a norm that was acceptable, right? And so
we'll just grind through it.
We'll grind through it.
It's a nice to have, but not a need to have.
Right. I'll figure it out. I guess I'm not entitled to that. And so the fact that millennials and now Gen Zs are being much more vocal about what they need. And if they're not going to get it, they're happy to go find something else or someplace else. That's difficult for us because we think, well, I wasn't allowed to do that. So who are you to want to do that? Right. Instead of saying, good for them. I wish I had been given permission to have that conversation. And so the cost is one, loss of talent, right? And it's not just, and this is really important, I think, right now, it's not just our Gen Zs and our millennials that are deciding to leave. I have a high degree concern actually about our baby boomers because baby boomers came with very strong organizational loyalty as a whole, right? They were products of a generation that, you we're grateful to the company that gave you your start, and you're going to work and grind and work your way, get the gold watch and all the way up the ladder, just like some of their parents' generation, and retire from that one place after 40 years or however many years it is. The last generation that really felt that way, inherently loyal to one organization. And now what we're seeing, so all baby boomers will be eligible to retire in the United States by 2030. So we're less than a decade out from that. They won't, obviously. Many will continue to work for a long time. They're healthier and living longer. The question is, where will they work? And many are deciding now that they're not going back to the place they were at before the pandemic because they don't feel valued and appreciated. So yes, it's important for younger generations, but Gentelligence is about championing every generation. And older generations, they want to feel appreciated. They want to feel like they matter. And while they don't necessarily, always have the same priorities and goals, many of them want to be able to pass down what they've learned. They want to pass down that knowledge and wisdom. I found another stat that said 21% of baby boomers say that they've not passed down any of the knowledge they gained during their careers to anyone else in their organization. And so if you think about the cost, back to your question, of those people leaving before retirement, before we thought they were going to, what's that going to cost you, right? If you haven't put any structures in place to allow your older workers to start teaching or mentoring or put processes in place that create a productive and healthy intergenerational dynamic where their knowledge and experience will be appreciated or heard instead of blown off as old school, they're going to walk out the door with all of that and you're never going to get it back.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah,
that's
true.
A huge cost. And so that's just at those two ends of the generational spectrum. You lose your people, you lose everything they know and those perspectives.
Yeah,
it's
we're almost immeasurable. Right? It's really hard to even measure.
Yeah.
Well, that's really important. I think as you were saying that, I'm thinking about the great irony here is millennials and Gen Zs, and these aren't labels. I think the research bears this out, that they really are connected to purpose and mission and appreciation. And there's much more of that connection you spoke about. And they're very vocal about that. Mm-hmm. So they're looking for companies and organizations that have something that goes beyond the product they sell or the service they provide. They want a mission-minded environment to work in. And the irony here is the boomers that are in the situation you talked about, they've worked their whole life for the gold watch. And maybe the pandemic has been the tipping point for them to realize, what was it all worth? Mm-hmm. They really do want something more meaningful. And they're kind of looking back now saying, what's the tombstone going to read? We're on the backside of the mountain. Have I done enough to leave a legacy? Mm-hmm. And so they're looking for that. So that's pretty fascinating to me. And if you can, if you're listening out there and you're in a leadership position, to Megan's point, if you can create an environment where those two can come together and thrive, You're going to capture that institutional wisdom of the older people, give them a path to feeling purposeful by helping bring the millennials and the Gen Zs into it. Us Gen Xers, we're just going to keep grinding. No, I'm just kidding. But involve us if you can, right? We'll do the work while you guys are all group hugging the boomers and the millennials. But that is such a powerful thing. And I wonder, here's my question to the audience. Does your organization have a strategy to do these things? Not just this piece of institutional knowledge transfer, but to actually create a perspective of what the different generations, what's the value they bring and what are the strengths, as opposed to looking at the things that maybe drive you nuts about the other generation. And is there a strategy in play? We have strategies for everything in companies, right? We got a sales strategy, we got a marketing strategy, we got an HR strategy, we got a supply chain, we got strategies for everything. But how many companies that actually have a multi-generational communication strategy?
Right. And that's different than a succession plan, right? That's a very different thing. And my favorite story on this, Jeff, is I was talking to a student of mine. Hopefully he won't mind. I won't name him, but family business, which is an interesting Gentelligence niche, right? Lots of front row seat to all of these dynamics. And he was talking about his grandfather, and it was his grandfather's company. And he's retired. His dad's running the company. He's deciding if he's going to step in and work there after graduation. And he said, my grandpa is retired, but he's not really retired. And he really wants to continue to be involved. And we're trying to figure out, we want him to be involved. We want him to feel respected, but his responsibilities have changed. My dad is now doing the things he used to do. And so it's kind of awkward. So we had this great discussion. And I said, well, what is your grandpa great at? Like, what are the things, that you feel he does better than anybody else? And he said, well, he can close the sale like nobody's business.
He's the closer.
He's the closer. He can negotiate. He can do all these things. And he said, yeah, it's really interesting. We have two people, my grandpa and this other gentleman in his age. And this other gentleman's a people leader. He's not great at being a people leader, but he's really great at storytelling. He can tell people, our new employees, all these stories about the culture and the and all these things. And he said, I don't know what we're going to do when we lose the two of them, because who's going to tell all of these stories about why we care about what we care about? And they had another employee in a similar age who had died unexpectedly. And he's like, he took all of his wisdom, with him. We just had this great conversation about well, what do you think his needs are? Like, what do you think he's really wanting to contribute? And I said, what I think would be really fascinating is I said, can you talk to him about whether he'd be willing to do some training or some sort of way to capture not just his stories, but his tips, his secrets? How do you close a sale? And I said, not for the general, you're not going to put it on YouTube or TikTok or whatever. It's internal training. I said, but for the future of the company, wouldn't you want every new employee to hear your grandpa talk about why he founded this company and what the company is all about? And I said, he's like, yeah, he's not great with technology. I said, but you are, right? Like, what a moment to sit down with your grandpa and tape his stories and ask him questions. And then you could turn that into training videos that will live forever, right? And in the book, when we were researching, I found this term, it's called generativity. And generativity tends to be something, it's wanting to pass on what you know to the next generation. And it, of course, is more frequent in older people, but it's not a given. And so per your question, I think the question I would want organizations to think about is, do you have a strategy for motivating generativity, right? Because if you're an older person or you've worked in an organization for decades and you perceive that nobody values your experience or that you're being pushed out for this shiny new digitally tech, savvy set of employees, what's your motivation to share what you know? You're not saying, we're always going to do it this way or that's the only way to do it. But can you motivate and show that you value and you would love to find a way to embrace and appreciate and teach those things to the next generation? And do you have a structure in place? Because it's not going to happen naturally, right? They're not going to want to give their knowledge to somebody that they think is going to, not want it or appreciate it. And younger people may not know that they need it or want it, right? They might think, well, I don't want to be talked down to by somebody who, thinks they know best when I don't know that that's true, right? What is the organization and the leadership doing in order to facilitate those conversations?
That's good. You're so right. I think the older generation, especially the boomers, is that don't speak unless being spoken to mindset, and then they get frustrated if they feel like they're not appreciated, and so they're not going to go volunteer that information. I'm broad brush stroking, right? I'm overgeneralizing, but I think that's really, really impactful, and it's never been more important because, to your point, they're aging out. And they're not only aging out, they're leaving places that maybe they have 40 years of institutional knowledge and they just don't feel like they're living their purpose for the remaining years they've got left. And so how much more purposeful would they feel if somebody were to go to them and say, hey, we really want your wisdom to push it all the way down through the next couple of generations. So we've talked a lot about how to appreciate the differences in the generations. The focus in the marketplace tends to be, I think, hey, boomers, Xers, you guys have to learn how to appreciate millennials and Zs. What about the other way around? How would a millennial, what advice would you have to the millennials and the Gen Zs out there about what they might need to think about differently? Because they're still primarily working for Gen Xers and boomers, though that's starting to switch.
It is, yep.
But what advice would you give to them to help them be better communicators with those above their generation?
Right. I was fascinated when I was writing a chapter on leadership in the book because current stats show that 40% of people work for a boss who's younger than they are. So we are starting to see that shift. And so it's relevant to your question because many millennials, our oldest millennials, are 40 this year, or maybe 41. And middle management, very driven, sometimes leapfrogging over Gen Xers. And so it's happening. But often because of reshuffling or whatever, managerial fast track programs we develop for millennials, they may be leading people older than them on their team, right? And that's an interesting challenge in and of itself. And so I talk a lot with this age group about how do you appreciate and respect that viewpoint? How do we value it? How do we utilize it without it being, the only word on the subject, right? It's a very high level of leadership. Let's just take, for example, if I'm leading a team and I have 3 or 4 team members who are baby boomers and I'm a Gen Xer, they're probably not going to like that, right? That doesn't seem, we're very traditionally steeped in the idea that, age is where leadership comes from, and people with more experience lead people with less experience. And, I think a lot of it in terms of being successful is looking at how do I partner with this person? Not that this person reports to me or I'm in charge of them. How do I partner with this person and show them I care about and want to learn from them while still making sure that I'm the leader and whatever that means in your organization. And you have to think about those needs, right? What does it mean to gain respect? Well, if I'm a new leader and I'm a Gen Xer, maybe respect for me is my leadership position and people viewing me as an authority. Well, for a baby boomer, maybe respect is defined as my experience matters here. They're going to ask me for my input, right? And I continue to sort of piece apart for people. You can ask for someone's input. It doesn't mean you're giving away your power. It doesn't mean you're giving away your authority, and saying, well, Ted, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Or, Ted, help me understand your concerns about this one. Or another key phrase, if we're being really practical, that I talk about a lot in my work is, how would you do it? Because again, you're showing respect. I believe there's something valuable in all of your years of experience. I'm not here to say I know better than you when you have all of these years. I'm not substituting your judgment for my own, but I'm very interested in learning from you. Yep. And also by partnering and creating allies, right? There's that word. I love asking for advice, whether it's from younger or older people. What would your advice for me be on this? And people think when you do that, you put yourself in a one down position. Oh, she doesn't know what she's doing. Well, think about what happens when somebody asks you for your advice. You immediately become their champion because they thought enough of you to ask for your opinion and your insights. And now you want them to be successful. And so now I have a partner. I have somebody with all kinds of experience I don't have. Not that I don't have really valuable expertise and experience myself, but it's not a fixed pie. Right.
Yeah.
One of our practices in the book is expand the pie. It's not like if I give you respect and ask for your input and give you some power in terms of being heard, that I have less.
Yeah.
Right. You're going to respect and listen to me more. Right. We're going to expand that pie. And so I think for younger people, what could you learn from people who have been there a long time? And it's different kinds of knowledge, right? That's the thing about, we worry, and going back to your original question or your original point about self-preservation. If what I know is important, that doesn't mean what you know is less important, right? If the organization values my particular expertise that has come up growing up in my generation, in my era, that doesn't mean they don't value your kind of expertise. And that was part of the millennial sort of tension, was because the millennials were our first digital natives, they inherently knew how to do something naturally the rest of us were learning. And there's no evidence showing that older people can't use technology well, but we didn't grow up with it as just a accessible, we still got to stop and think about it. It's not our natural, sort of go-to. And so just because that's a valuable kind of expertise we need in our organizations, it doesn't mean experience isn't, right? And so I think for me, the advice for younger people would be, how do you expand that pie and partner with people older and recognize how much there is to learn without feeling like somehow it makes your influence or power or expertise less important?
That absolutely, I think when it really comes down to human, this is where you go back to the things that make us similar, right? Sometimes we look at them as different. And was it Covey or Zig Ziglar said, humility isn't thinking less of yourself. Isn't thinking of yourself less. It's thinking less of yourself.
Right.
And so if you have a mindset that, I think fear, right? Fear drives a lot of our behaviors in general as human beings. As a millennial or Gen Z who's managing or leading older folks, my fear is maybe they won't take me serious. My fear is maybe they're going to run roughshod over me. My fear is fill in the blank, whatever your fear might be. But that fear then drives your behavior. And their behavior then is I'm going to shut down. I'm not going to try to expand the pie. Because if I do and I give them more of a voice, then they're going to do even more of the fear I feared from the beginning. Whereas the opposite, right? We know humility, authenticity, honesty with the right amount of vulnerability is such a path to connection. And it only attracts people to you regardless of your generation, because that's the really kind of base human condition. That's really, really helpful. So as we kind of bring this thing to a close, we've really unpacked a lot of the concepts in your book already. But if you could give the audience maybe just a quick rundown of what they might learn, not only in the book, but the workshops that go along with the book. And again, we've covered a lot of it, I think, already. But what is this, a couple of the high points here from Gentelligence? If you haven't already gone on, if you're listening, if you're sitting at your desk, you should already go on to Amazon or your preferred book provider and get the book. But what would that be? What's the commercial for Gentelligence for you? What can I learn from this?
Sure. The first part of the book, which, by the way, I want to say I co-authored with two millennials. So they're two former students of mine. You cannot write a book.
I skipped over those chapters.
Well,
I'm teasing.
You can't write a book on the power of generational diversity by yourself. That becomes very inauthentic, I think. So we talk about, in the first part of the book, what's our current state? How did we get here? Of course, sort of generations 101. What are the roadblocks, right? Why aren't we getting this right? And there's a lot of them, which I think people it will resonate, that people will recognize a lot of those. And then, the center of the book is our Gentelligence practices. We call that the Gentelligence solution, those really practical things. Okay, great, Megan, what do I actually do about it?
That's the toolbox.
The applied toolbox, right? And some strategies in there we talk about. And then the latter part of the book is applying those strategies to the things that, organizations are most challenged with right now. People strategies. Who will your talent be? Where are they going to work? The book was actually, our deadline for the book was April 1st, 2020. And our publisher was in New York. So they closed and furloughed everyone for 4 months. And so we actually, even though that was obviously a scary thing, we had time to rewrite that section about remote work and where we will work and all of those things and talk about the pandemic. So that was kind of, a great opportunity. But then we also talk about Gentelligent leadership. So leading up, leading down, depending on the dynamic. One of our favorite chapters, Secrets of Gentelligent Teams. So how do you get that team dynamic to work out when your teammates are different generations? Building Gentelligent cultures. How do we set those norms in place? And then the last chapter is about applying these concepts to the future of work, right? We have a demographic shift in our midst where our generation dynamic is, of course, like you said, more generations ever than before working together, but our population is getting older. Our number of young people is plummeting and will hit, kind of a basement here before too long. How do we adjust? What do we do with that? And so we really try to kind of lay out the problem, the solution, and then how to apply it and just to make it as most useful as possible.
That's fantastic. And I know you're well sought after speaker, not just a professor, but a speaker who goes out and talks about this all the time. I mentioned your website at the beginning. If you could give everybody again where to go to find more information about you, where to book you as a speaker, where to learn more about your workshops, all that, where can we go?
Yeah, that's great. It's www.profgerhardt, PROFGERHARDT.com is my website, and inquiries for talks and webinars and workshops. I'm on, of course, LinkedIn. My social media is at Prof. Gerhardt. So you can find me any of those places.
At Prof. Gerhardt. Go follow her, go to the website. Those HR professionals and leaders that are listening that need a great speaker on this topic, please book her. I encourage you to do so. I've learned a ton just by having this conversation with you on a podcast. I feel challenged, and hopefully my team, especially my millennials, hopefully feel that I feel motivated to go do something about this. So it was an honor. Thank you for being part of the Driving Change podcast.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It was great.
You're welcome back anytime.
Great. Thank you so much.